In this lesson, we will look at ancient Greek writers, including Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and Aristotle. These are four of the most famous writers from ancient Greece. Herodotus. He was an ancient Greek historian. He is considered the father of history. He lived about 2,500 years ago. He wrote a book called The Histories, which is still available today. He travelled a lot. For example, he went to Egypt, so he actually travelled around and investigated things. He wrote the Histories, and as part of this, he talked about the Persian Wars. His digression in Book 6 provides much useful information about the Spartan army and also about other Greek attitudes towards Sparta. Thucydides was an ancient Greek historian. He lived about 2,400 years ago. He wrote a book called The History of the Peloponnesian War. This was a great war between Athens and its allies, the other Greek city-states, and Sparta and its allies, which were other Greek city-states. And they had a big war which lasted a long time, it lasted for a few decades, and Sparta won. He is considered the father of scientific history. So you've got Herodotus, the father of history in general, because he's recorded what happened, but Thucydides took a more in-depth approach and is considered the father of scientific history because he investigated things more. And it was because of his way of investigating the past. Thucydides Sparta's eunomia, good order, but criticised some aspects of it. So he liked Sparta to a certain extent, but he criticised some aspects of it. For example, their culture and city. He wrote mostly of the Peloponnesian War between rivals Athens and Sparta, which Sparta won. Perhaps it is why he admires the methods Sparta used. And his book is still available today. A lot of students who do the HSC and study the Peloponnesian War will read his book. And the book written by Herodotus is also still available. You can buy their books, go into a bookstore and just buy it or order on the internet. These books are fairly easy to get a hold of. So it's quite extraordinary that 2,500 years later, people are still reading these books. Suppose the city of Sparta was deserted. Distant ages would be unwilling to believe a great power existed there. Now, this is something Thucydides wrote about Sparta, and what he was saying was Sparta didn't look that impressive. If you went to ancient Sparta, it wouldn't impress you that much. The reason is, if you saw ancient Sparta, it looked like a group of villages. It looked like a group of villages. And on the outskirts of the city, they had the main religious sites. So this is a bit different to other cities. I mean, Athens, for example, they had the great temples, inside the city. I mean, the great temple like the Parthenon is inside the city and the buildings surround it. People lived around it. So if you look at Athens, it's quite an impressive city. But in Sparta, it wasn't like that. So if you were to visit ancient Sparta, you probably wouldn't be that impressed by it. You'd think, what's this? It's just a few villages. But, it was a great power. And I think the other issue was the Spartans themselves. They lived a very modest lifestyle. And that's another reason why you might not have been impressed by visiting ancient Sparta. They weren't very extravagant. On the contrary, a modest style of dressing, more in conformity with modern ideas, was first adopted by the Spartans. So once again, he's talking about their style of dress and how they were quite modest. Their houses, their buildings, their style of dressing was all quite modest. Xenophon, he was an ancient Greek writer. He was a historian. He was a soldier. He was a mercenary. That means he gets paid to work for someone else as a soldier. And he was a student of Socrates, who was one of the greatest ancient Greek philosophers. He was born in Athens, and this makes him really interesting He was born in Athens, but he liked Sparta. He lived about 2,400 years ago. He wrote Hellenica, which is about the Peloponnesian War. It starts at the time Thucydides' history finishes. So some people believe that Thucydides died before he could finish the book, and this writer, Xenophon, wrote his own book, which just continues after Thucydides finished. So it's quite good you've got that continuation there. He was supportive of Sparta, and this is very interesting because he was born in Athens. You might think he's biased and doesn't like the Spartans, but he was supportive of Sparta. He owned an estate in Sparta, and Xenophon admired the Spartan system and its military power. So it's quite extraordinary. You have an Athenian who can see the good in the Spartan system, and he's not biased, he's just seeing the good in them and recognising what good they had. He appeared to like some of Sparta's cultural insights. He offers a rare glimpse into Sparta as an Athenian who left to stay in Laconia. So Laconia is the region where Sparta was located. He was an Athenian, but he left and he stayed in the region of Sparta. He stayed in Laconia. A. Andrews noted, all the admiration lavished on Spartan military virtue by Xenophon. So it's Xenophon who gives Sparta all this great credit for being such a great military power. He gives them a lot of this credit. He taught the children from a desire to render them more dexterous in securing provisions and better qualified for warfare. Willingness to obey prevailed among them. And instead of their clothes to make them delicate, Lycurgus required them to become used to a single garment all year round. So Xenophon's talking about the Spartan way of life and how they were tough and didn't have a lot of clothes. The idea being that they would be better prepared for cold and heat. Aristotle lived in the 4th century BC. He was a great philosopher and a scientist of ancient Greece. He was a tutor to Alexander the Great. And he's considered one of the greatest intellects of the ancient world and one of the greatest intellects of ancient Greece. And he tutored Alexander the Great, who ended up becoming a king when he was only 20, and he conquered most of the known world. By the time he was 32, Alexander the Great had conquered the Persian Empire. He'd taken over Egypt and the Middle East. He ruled what we now call Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, Persia, even parts of Afghanistan. He ruled this great empire. And then he died, Alexander the Great died when he was only 32. So it was a bit sad. He died in the city of Babylon, which is in what we now call Iraq. But Aristotle was the tutor to Alexander the Great, this great man who conquered most of the known world. Aristotle seems to complain a lot about the Spartans. You've got to keep things in perspective. He was an Athenian, so naturally he might have been a bit biased. He was from Athens, which was, of course, the major rival to Sparta. But Sparta was actually in decline in Aristotle's time. He is extremely critical of the Spartan system, especially of their emancipated women. That means they're free women. Women had a lot of freedom in Sparta. They tended to have a lot of freedom. Their clothes weren't very modest. Like, they were modest to a certain extent, but they revealed their legs and so on. They owned land or had land in their name. So Aristotle didn't like a lot of these types of things, or they just seemed to have a lot of freedom that he wasn't happy about. The license of the Lacedaemon women defeats the intention of the Spartan constitution and is adverse to the happiness of the state. The Spartans brutalize their children. They go about it completely the wrong way. So he's criticising things there, he's criticising the women, he's criticising the treatment of children and so on. The Lacedaemonian constitution is defective in another point. I mean the ephorality. The ephors are chosen from the whole people, who, being badly off, are open to bribes. So he didn't feel that, you should let everyone have a vote and choose the ephors. So that was another criticism he had.